Um, My name is Professor Michael Manuelak. I'm a professor here at the Norman Patterson School. I'm delighted today to be joined by Senator Peter Boehm to talk about his landmark and very important report, More Than a Vocation, Canada's Need for a 21st Century Foreign Service. It's an exciting and important report that is based really on extensive research that was guided by two former deputy ministers, Peter Boehm and Peter Harder. They've done extensive research. They had extensive hearings. If you want to get background, don't just read the report, but read also the committee hearings. They had many important witnesses. I've read many of their testimonies, and you can learn a lot about the state of Canadian foreign policy and diplomacy through that. It's also very timely. The world is changing very rapidly. Canada's position and Canada itself is changing very rapidly. Technology is changing the nature of diplomacy and with it. And I think the report does a really excellent job in tackling these issues.
Él está llevando a su esposa a unos exámenes médicos. Pablo, pero él los tiene mañana. Espero que esté aquí a las 10. A la llave está aquí en el. Coge.
¿Quién está hablando?
You should probably mute the other on the Zoom side. So the report is timely in the sense that that Canadian diplomacy and its position in the world is changing. The role of the Foreign Service is changing. It's also timely in the sense that we haven't had a similar report for since 1981. So that's more than 40 years ago. The McDougall report came, so it's long overdue. It's based on comparative research. The senator and others took trips to Washington, to London, to Oslo, to Berlin. So they were able to put the position of Canada's Foreign Service in a real comparative context. And I think that really adds a lot to the report and the analysis. So here to discuss the important report today is Senator Peter Boehm, retired. He's been a senator since October 2018 as a representative senator for Ontario. He retired as deputy minister and for the G7 summit process and the Prime Minister's personal representative G7 Sherpa in 2017. He's deputy minister of international development, ambassador to Germany from 2008 to 2012. He was ADM America's North American consular officials. He was the ambassador and permanent representative to the OES. The short point is he's succinctly put, he's ideally well positioned to really weigh in on Canada's foreign service and its role in the world. Most importantly, he's an alum of this school. As he was just telling you about his thesis research in the Canadian foreign policy field at NPSIA in the late 1970s, studying under Arnold Smith, former Canadian ambassador and the first Secretary General of the Commonwealth of Nations. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome Senator Peter Boehm.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. And it's a pleasure to be here. And I want to just at the outset acknowledge that we're on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin peoples. I'm also happy to be here as school. It's much smaller when I was here, and it was in a different location. It was in Patterson Hall. But you know, the issues that you're studying in the school, of course, not changed that much. The world has moved on, but there are still traditional divides and challenges to see. I want to thank everyone who joined us online as well, including, I believe, some of my former colleagues. It would be very easy to stand here and talk about policy in a turbulent world, but instead I do want to focus on the report that the Senate issued just before Christmas. It's right here. It has that arresting cover with floppy disks on it that we have commented on. That was, I think, quite intentional as an image of how the world has changed and also how technology has changed. And I think we can also come back to that issue of technology. I want to say that this is a Senate committee report. It is not written by one person. There was a tremendous effort behind it in terms of staff work, research, and the like. So it's not yours truly and my colleague Peter Harder who did this. We steered it, we shepherded it, but it is good solid work coming from Library of Parliament and our staff. people in our offices and throughout the Senate. A long labor of over a year. And the purpose really of the study was to see whether the Foreign Service of today is up to 21st century challenges. So that's a lot of that is human resource based, but it's also structures at Global Affairs Canada. When I joined the Foreign Service, it was the Department of External Affairs. During my career, it had 3 or 4 different names. And that's really comment on the length of my career. I don't, but just the fact that it has changed as well over the years. And the question of fit for purpose, that's in the global context, but also in response to demographic changes within our own country. And indeed, how governments work and governments work together. I strongly believe that we have in our country a world-class foreign service. And I also think it could be much better and much improved. It needs to adapt, it needs to become more agile and respond to the current realities, but it also requires the support of governments. And that is with an S, it is not one government. You have to remember that the Department of External Affairs was established in 1909 above a barber shop on Bank Street. And it has expanded over the years. There are now almost 14,000 employees spread across headquarters and through 178 missions abroad in 110 countries. There are some 8,300 who are what we call Canada-based employees, of which about 2,000 are traditional foreign service, and about 5,600 are locally engaged staff. Of the Canada-based, only about 19% serve abroad. And in the 1990s, the Foreign Service officers comprised about 50% of the Canada-based staff. Now it is down to about 26%. The average Foreign Service age in 2021 was 47, which is not really that great when you think about it. I joined in my 20s. It seems like only yesterday. It obviously wasn't, but 47 is not a good sort of average marker if you are looking at the development of a career over time, where in the traditional sense you would be taking on different assignments, whether abroad or at headquarters, with varying rates of responsibility. If you're lucky, if everything goes your way, if you put in a good performance, then you can look towards being a head of mission, a director, general assistant minister, or whatever. So that is, I think, part of the challenge, and that is because there was no recruitment for about 10 years. It's an annual recruitment exercise. I remember writing the Foreign Service exam when I was a student here, and I received a nice form of rejection letter. So just didn't make the cut. Too bad. I thought, how could they refuse? So I tried again 2 years later, and it clicked, mainly because I couldn't get a job anywhere else because the salaries were very low. I was doing graduate studies in Europe at the time, and everything I had applied for, I was rejected. So here they came offering a meager salary, but a chance to represent your country and see the world. So I stayed. So that suspension of recruitment, I think, is an important aspect that the government needs to redress. It is happening. In the past couple of years, there have been 2 recruitment exercises, but I would suggest that the onboarding takes too long. So it's everything from getting your clearances. There's also a security clearance involved, and that if a person has to wait for a year or 2 years and doesn't get a straightforward answer, obviously they're going to look at other options for career, whether it's private sector, academia. The world is moving much more quickly now. Now, also at the same time, because there was no recruitment, about 20% of the foreign service positions, mainly at headquarters, are filled by what are called non-rotational staff. So these are professionals who would have been hired on in a term capacity, or students who then remain permanent, but still not foreign service. So by that, foreign service, you have to assume and accept the principle of rotationality, which in theory meant, at least when I joined, you were told where you're going to go abroad, and it's an instruction on a card. Then you sign on to be rotational. You're going to go to different places. And on the TV or radio the other day, someone was asking me about choice, and I remember joining and during orientation, and a colleague, the immigration service was integrated at that time as well for new officers. She was from St. Catharines, Ontario, and was looking forward to traveling and living abroad. And her first posting given to her was Buffalo, which is less than an hour, depending on how long it takes to cross the border. She went on to have a very successful career in different parts of the world. So, but I think that has changed. And the only point I'm trying to make is that these people who are basically at headquarters doing the same sort of work, whether they're on a country desk or doing something multilateral, then do not necessarily have the same option to go abroad. That will be reserved for the foreign service officers. So that is part of the challenge. It's reflected to some degree in our report. How do you ensure equity among employees for those who are essentially doing the same job, but who also might be represented by different bargaining agents in the system, because the unions have some power. When I joined, it was basically a sort of a professional guild or association. It's still called the Professional Association of Foreign Service Officers. They were important in terms of their testimony to our committee, but they had no real negotiating power at that time. Now they do, and I think foreign service officers do fairly well. There have been two since the McDougall Commission report, which Professor Manuak cited in his introduction. There have been two amalgamations in 81 or 81, I think. There was the Trade Commissioner Service, which had been formerly part of Ministry of Trade and Commerce. That moved into External Affairs, and it became DFAIT, so Foreign Affairs and International Trade. In 2013, there was the amalgamation of CETA, and that is now 10 years behind us, but that was also an important amalgamation. And the whole idea in terms of doing this, whether it was the Trudeau government, senior Trudeau government at the outset on the Trade Commissioner Service, or the Harper government in amalgamating CETA, the idea was to get policy and savings through the system, make it everything more efficient. Other countries have done that. We went to London. The Brits very much copied what we did. I found it interesting as a former DM International Development, having worked with DFID, former British agency for development. I always saw them as a thought leader. And when they received their boost, their monetary boost, because under the Cameron government in the UK, there was legislation to legislate 0.7 ODA GNI, which, as some of you know, is from the original report back in 1972, the University Commission of the World Bank. And they did that. So suddenly they had an infusion of some 13 million pounds to work. So they had to be very creative. They have since retrenched them. They've since cut their budget. So this is in the UK. So we drew some comparisons there. I think, and the committee sort of suggests it, but that this is still a work in progress. and needs action. Different ways of managing projects. On the development side, you have long-term projects that where you deal with partners. They can take 5 and 6 years. On the security and democratic development side, smaller number in terms of budget and projects that are much shorter term. So how do you make that all work is a big question in terms of aspect. The overall budget in 2021 was $9.3 billion. It is now calculated lower than that, 7.6 billion, and the component devoted to systems, peace and security is about 4.7 billion. So that's just a bit of the backdrop I wanted to offer in terms of where our recommendations fall. And I also wanted to say that Canada does not exist in any sort of a splendid isolation in terms of. We went to Washington. The Americans, of course, the State Department is 10 times the size of what we have, and that fits the usual 10 times the size approach in our relationship with the US, whether it's population, whether it's GDP, or whether Joe Biden needs 1,000 rooms for his delegation and Justin Trudeau needs 100. That particular 10% rule it seems, but recruitment is a challenge in the US as well in the State Department. How do you ensure that you have an equitable recruitment system across the wide scope of what the United States does? And you're not just hiring people from the so-called Ivy League schools and colleges in the United States. And so we've had that challenge, coming back to recruitment for a moment, in Canada as well, because you want to have a pan-Canadian approach that goes east to west, north to south. And during this period of relatively meager recruitment, the focus had very much been on the central Canadian corridor in terms of hires. It was easy to do, but we should have more people joining from British Columbia and Newfoundland and from the north of America. So that's part of our recommendations as well. The Norwegians, we were in Oslo. They're cutting missions, and yet Norway is a country that is out there really punching above its weight. Say that. We say that we are, and we're not doing it. So you can have different approaches. The Germans are going through similar restructuring exercises. It's very interesting. So I just want to indicate that we're not, in this sense, alone. So the recommendations, I would divide them into various categories. Some of them merge. Most are corporate, as I said, and HR based. And these, the report, and I want to emphasize again, this was a report endorsed by the entire committee. So all Senate groups are represented on this committee, including the official opposition. And it was a group effort. So we left it relatively general in some areas and more specific in others. And that then suggests to the government, we're going to start debate on the report next week. Hopefully it will be approved, and then the clock ticks and the government has a certain period of time within which to respond. But it basically gives the government a ballot, a framework, say, look, this is what we think. We know you're involved in your own internal transformation exercise. We know it's tough to do, the combination of minority government to save money. What can you achieve as you look forward and transform? So our exercise is very separate. We can make recommendations that maybe the House of Commons committees can't do that if you want, and the government needs to pay attention to what comes out of the Senate. The Senate has a long history of reports and studies that have borne fruit. It also has a history of studies that have not borne fruit and have been ignored, and we're hoping that this one will not be. So I'm going to highlight a few of the recommendations. I'm not going to go through all 29, but the ones that I see are important. I don't know how many of you have read the report. Show of hands. Okay, good. Well, I could do a pop quiz then. Or maybe not. But the first one is really important, and that is outreach across the country to institutions, post-secondary like this one, but even into high schools where civics courses there's been a lot of talk about civics and how civics is studied in our country, but it seems to me that Global Affairs Canada could be reaching out better. There are platforms and ways to do this now. We learned that through the pandemic, where you could in fact zoom into classrooms without actually going there. It is very cheap to do that, and you don't leave a carbon footprint behind in terms of the travel that you undertake. So I think in the past there were in-person programs for ambassadors and across the country. You can do that online if you're sitting in Asia or in Africa. There were job fairs at universities as well, and I think since recruitment is on again, there might be a way to do an online job fair or other things like that, just to make it clear what the department does. Like that also means reaching out to editorial boards, reaching out to journalism, because I have found in my career, journalists, and here I'm talking mainstream, will focus on the issues that are controversial, or if someone misbehaves, that's always a big story, but don't necessarily capture the essence of what it is to be broad, where you are looking at garnering influence for your country, representing your country, whether you're promoting trade, whether you are negotiating a trade agreement, or indeed just involved in a bilateral relationship with a country where you want to exercise influence, where you want to work with others. I include some national entities in this too, because our provinces are very active abroad, and there has to be a collaborative effort. And I've had some challenges over the years in that area, certainly at one time when a very internationally minded Parti Québécois was in charge in Quebec. But in any event, I think getting messages out, and today, of course, with social media, there is a lot of distortion. We can get into examples later on. So on amalgamations, I've touched on this. They were meant to provide policy coherence, and that is great in theory, but new organizational charts need to be accompanied by changes in governance and culture. And I know this is happening, and I'm sorry, Antoine, I'm going to point you out. Antoine Chevrier is here from Global Affairs Canada, who's working on the transformation exercise, but he also worked on the amalgamation exercise, as did I in 2013. And these things are not easy, because you're basically melding cultures in order to form another one, and it's a challenge. And of course, you will get some direction from the political level, which is simply usually, well, just do it. Let us know how you do it. We'll either accept it or reject it, but it is not really that binary. And things like elections can get in the way. Sorry, but that's how it is in a democracy. So that is something that I think is ongoing. And of course, the other factors that influence that are what's happening in the world. And I don't think that we could have predicted, certainly I wouldn't have predicted the poly-crisis environment that we're in now, where a government and a department and the Foreign Service have to be prepared to make policy recommendations. They have to be prepared to keep people people safe and secure, evacuate Canadians from war zones, respond to international climatic disasters and the like, and work with your allies through the entire period. And there might be a few wars going on as well. So this requires an agile workforce and an organization that is very much tooled to quick response. Senior management has grown over the years at Global Affairs Canada. It is probably too top heavy, but also it is indicative of a culture where various and successive governments have laid on more mandates and expected that the department would respond within its given resource base. When it cannot do that or cannot do it sufficiently enough, then it's a case, well, you can't have more money because you've got such a big budget now. Make it work. Yet every cutting exercise, and I can't comment on the current one, but I can comment on the ones that I was involved in under the Chrétien government, the program reviewed in the mid-90s, and later the Deficit Reduction Action Plan of the Harper government. There were cuts made, but before there was always an attempt, well, prioritize. Decide what are your top 10 priorities and then your bottom 10 and eliminate the bottom 10. And it doesn't always work that way because everything is important. Then what happens is that somewhere at the center, Treasury Board, usually they will say, okay, well, then just cut 10% across the board. And then you lose some very good programs. Let me give you one little vignette. I give you this one because it's such a long time ago. I remember in 1998, I was ambassador to the Organization of the Rights. Important area, policy area for us at that time because we were hosting a number of processes, the General Assembly of the OAS in Windsor, the Summit of the Americas in Quebec City in 2001. And we were going, the government was going to Santiago, Chile, to the second summit of the, and before that, as part of the Chrétien program review, it had been decided that we would get out of various inter-American organizations or reduce our contribution. So we got on the Airbus with Mr. Chrétien, who was the Prime Minister, and we flew to Nassau, picked up the Caribbean leaders. We're good at giving rides to our friends. And then, it was a very quiet flight down to Nassau, and from Nassau to Santiago, it was almost like party time in the aircraft with Mr. Chrétien doing the bilateral meetings he had with the staff with Jean Pelletier and myself as the note taker, central expert. And by the time we landed in Santiago, we were back in every organization that we had said we were getting out of. So it just doesn't really work that way. We are also suggesting greater mobility of officers between streams and also across government and different departments. When you look at the structure of government of Canada, almost every department or agency has an international affairs director where they have certain expertise. Even the ones you don't really think about so much. So fisheries and oceans, agriculture has big international affairs. And environment, that has gone huge. And in its day, there was an Environment Bureau at DFID as it was. But with the various COP meetings and the expertise required for that, other departments have built up their strength in specialist areas. That gets to the specialist and generalist debate. And if you look at our report and indeed some of the testimony, this was an issue that former Foreign Minister John Baird took on in his testimony. And all countries have this question. A generalist will be able to adapt very quickly to changing condition. But if you need a discussion or a negotiation on an esoteric point of trade policy. If you're negotiating an FTA, if you require a certain expertise on a development project, or if it's something that's quasi-scientific or security military, you will probably want to go to a specialist. So what we're recommending is that movement between departments occur, but that they not be just one-sided. So, okay, we're sending Officer X over to ISED, so to the industry. And goodbye, have a good time, we'll see you in a couple of years. Well, there's a rotation and we lose track of Officer X, who thinks is coming back into the fold, and we'll have a better and more responsible upward looking assignment. And that doesn't happen because it was a sort of a one-sided thing. But if you exchange people in between, and if the clerk says, all right, it's not just the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, but it's the Deputy Minister of all of these departments, you have to collaborate on that, and I want to see this happen, then maybe that's the way to go. So that's one thing. On the Foreign Service exam, it's great to have an SAT style exam, so you can figure out algebraic terms when train, what train is leaving the station and what's leaving. I'd flunk that. I mean, really. So we recommend that an exam tailored to individuals, because at the end of the day, you want two things. You want judgment and knowledge. And if you're in an embassy and you're under siege, whatever, if there's a crisis of some kind, you want to know that the person working beside you, if you're the head of mission, you want to have all of the capabilities to work with your team. Not having someone solve a very complicated equation as your walls are coming. Sorry, overstated. So and we also recommend on career management to have training roadmaps. In the day, I sound like there were assignment officers that would work with you in terms of planning your career. It was not an annual Hunger Games type exercise where you say, "Oh, I want that job. I'm going to get it one way or the other." It has to fit your career path, what makes sense to you, and getting advice, getting mentorship. That can be so important. Ditto on foreign language capability and investing in that for the length of a career. It sounds really good on paper, and we recommend that more funds be devoted to that. But sometimes careers don't follow a necessary path. We're a very diverse country. We have a diverse foreign service. We've achieved gender parity. We have greater representation of our diversity. There has to be more, and we recommend that as well. But if you have a certain foreign language skill, or you have a certain background, or it's seen as being some sort of an ethnic background, you get posted to a country where you are not necessarily received with open arms, because they, in the receiving country, will say, "Oh, but you're really one of us." Well, you're not. And we've seen that time and time again. So it becomes very difficult then if you're traveling with a partner, with family, or even by yourself, and you're going to go again and again there, you're not going to feel necessarily that comfortable, or that it's for you. We've had incidents. How do you handle those sorts of things? I think it's through some very active mentoring and having assignment officers. Similarly, we should be looking at niche strengths for Canada. The media laughed when Melanie Joly said we're a convener. We are a convener. If we have a meeting and we call people together, not only are we a convener, we can suggest various means of work and pathways to achieve things, whether it's in international organizations. We have a long history of that. Maybe we haven't been that active lately, but we do have that history. That should be encouraged. We are natural mediators as well. Why not push mediation button? The Norwegians do that. the Oslo Accords, it's a mess in the Middle East, of course, but the Oslo Accords came out of Oslo. Timor-Leste was also a Norwegian initiative. They tried as well behind the scenes on Venezuela. So if we can also do things like that. And in terms of public international law, don't farm it out to the Department of Justice. We have a very solid base at Global Affairs Canada. However you construct it, but it's negotiating treaties, it's dealing with complicated issues. The International Court of Justice decisions on the South African appeal, for example, are an example of that. Official language training should be ab initio. It's a start. You come in. If you don't speak both official languages, get the training. I received French training. My French is still pretty terrible, but I'm going to defend myself. And colleagues that were Francophone also received English training. I remember it very well from my time. That way, you can ensure that you have pan-Canadian recruitment, because not everyone is going to speak the official language or both official languages at all in all parts. So then there's the Foreign Service Directive. So if you ever want to read something that you might not get through, and we'll give you 9 years, that's what you read. And that is the underpinning for service abroad. It's very complicated. Does not reflect necessarily the 21st century and the realities of partnerships across families, relationships that might be same-sex, singles going abroad, and the supports, or those who have been abroad who might have a member with a family with a disability, as I have had personally. So that needs to be really looked at in the context. It's a Treasury Board thing. Maybe there could be more work done. So, and we've also suggested an advisory committee to the government. So put together an advisory team that includes academics, former practitioners, maybe a few parliamentarians, and see what you can do to help you on this path for this government and for any future government. So I'll conclude and just say that I think over the years we've really built an excellent foreign service, and there's evidence and results. We hear it from other countries. We don't hear it too much in our own. There's a stigma associated with it's cocktail parties and having fun. I remember when I joined, we had a very stern former ambassador who came to us in our orientation session and said that, you know, you're going to get invited to a lot of events, dinners, big events. If at any time during your attendance you feel like you're having fun, know that at that very moment you're not doing your job. Whoa, okay. So he had a point. It's important to attract Canadians, new Canadians, well, into our foreign service. And for some of us, still for me too, there is no greater thrill than you sitting behind that Canada sign and you were asked to speak. So thanks for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Senator B. So as you mentioned, we will have the opportunity to take a few questions. I'll abuse my position as host to pitch the first one, but then we can open it up to the floor. I don't think we can take any from online, or we can. Okay, so Anne's gonna be able to take some online as well. First question I'd like to ask, you talked about policy in a turbulent world right off the top, and you're going to focus on the report.
Pardon me just a second, I managed to spill the water. It's dripping
down. The Foreign Service is an instrument, it's a tool in service of a broader foreign policy. The report doesn't get too prescriptive in terms of foreign policy for some good reasons. But perhaps there is a foreign policy approach that's implied by some of the recommendations that you put forward. So I'd ask you what might be applied by the report as a kind of first question, and then secondly, you talked about prioritization, which is related to a broader policy. How would you envision that prioritization to occur? It is challenging with so many departments engaged. You mentioned the idea of DAC becoming a central agency. The idea dates back to Alan Gottlieb talking about these things, but what role does Global Affairs Canada have in articulating a whole of government foreign policy approach?
Well, thank you. That's a very difficult question, but expected from an expert in the field. So, as I said at the outset, our objective was not to conduct a foreign policy review. That is really up to governments themselves. I have a very deep personal attachment to several foreign policy reviews, and they all went nowhere because governments of the day could not really set the priorities, or there was an election and the incoming government say, no, we're not going to do that. We want to do this, electing our platform. You have to respect that. That's democracy. But I would like to think that this report does provide enough for a government that if it is conducting a foreign policy review, it will be able to look at the how. And so to some degree, we have the starts of that. I think Minister Joly has come out and said, talking about pragmatic diplomacy. Diplomacy is pragmatic by definition, because you basically work to have someone else come over to your side or to a middle point that is and in the practice, you probably give up a little bit of your sovereignty all along, certainly on the multilateral side. And there's been a greater emphasis by the government to focus and to strengthen our multilateral presence. If you look at the strength of missions, permanent missions at the UN in New York, you'll see that we are among the smaller ones in terms of our contemporaries, whether it's G7 or G20. So I think that is the purpose, really, to set out more on how to do this. And it goes back to the first recommendation too, that in setting up the how, you have to be able to explain to Canadians why. And I'm hoping that I haven't completely answered your question, but I'm hoping that the report will achieve something in that direction. Are you going to select?
Sure, I can moderate. Okay, so Teddy. Well, if there's somebody else before, then I think Val's out.
Thank you, Teddy. My name is Val Percival, and I'm a professor here at the Norman Patterson School. Thank you so much for coming and sharing both your experience and the findings of the report. I wanted to push you on 2 points that you didn't mention here, but I think were mentioned in the report, and that is experience internationally and the risk environment within global affairs. And one of the points I think that you made in your report is that senior management needs to have more experience, lived experience internationally. And I wondered if you had considered also the importance of lived experience in lower income contexts and fragile settings. I believe that the US State Department requires its foreign service personnel to do at least one hardship posting within their trajectory. So I wondered if you could comment on that. And the second is the risk environment. So Global Affairs Canada is notoriously risk averse. And one of the reasons for that is that when people take risks, they're not rewarded for that. And so I wondered if you could speak about how you can change that incentive structure for risk, including the importance of the challenge function, both within global affairs, but also externally. Global affairs and foreign policy experts being able to challenge and listen to. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Those are great questions. And listening to both of them, I recall you and I had some correspondence a few years ago on health and health policy issues, and you were far more prescient, certainly at that time. Risk, being averse to risk, I don't think it's just a Global Affairs Canada phenomenon. I think it exists across government. And I think it has been like that for some time, and I don't really know why. So some ideas, but when I joined the Foreign Service, it was very clear that you had to do things in a certain way, then go up to your supervisor, all the way up. And that is what's happening now. And I think it's become far worse. So you have assistant deputy ministers who are basically quite right. And as a result, they're burning out because they're responding to. This frustrates the political level, and I've seen that and experienced it firsthand. I've also experienced it as a DM, but it's and then there is the impression, well, they're not really doing their jobs because they're not acting quickly. And there are challenges to that risk environment. And I'll throw something else out here. I don't know whether working remotely a couple days a week is really the answer here either. And if you look this week with the cyber attack, no one is working remotely. So this was kind of brought in the pandemic. Everyone embraced it. You could change your keep your daycare arrangements and all of that. I'm not sure over the long term that is going to work, and I think goes to the risk environment, and it goes to duty of care. On the security side, I'm not sure we were talking about personal security, or I'm not sure.
Oh, sorry, I was talking about hardship postings.
Oh, hardship, yeah.
Yeah, so I understand that in the US, in the State Department, as part of the
Yeah.
career projection, there is a requirement that Foreign Service officers serve one duty within what's called a hardship post.
Yeah.
And I think that one could make the argument that it would be challenging to understand the geopolitical environment without having that lived experience
Sure.
in many.
We used to have that. I don't know whether it was ever written down, but when I was an assignment officer way back, you would look at someone's trajectory and say, okay, well, they've had a hardship post now. Maybe the next one would be for example, it would make sense. Then there are those who just love hardship postings because they like the developing world. The allowances are higher. If they have children, the children are young, it's easier to get help at home, all of these things. Or they specialize in that, and certainly our development colleagues, that's where they would be in hardship. There are some who consider Ottawa a hardship post, so there are those who want to continue to rotate out there, and at some point you have to rein them in and say, okay, yeah, we know your partner is from another foreign service or from another country or has another job abroad, but you have to look at equity in the system. And you're right. I mean, that's sort of in between the lines there, but not clearly articulated. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Boehm, for presenting the report. It's great to see you again. I have a couple of questions. I'm an economist by training, so I'm immediately thinking about fiscal environment and costs and what's going to happen. So obviously, when you were writing this report, I don't think you had heard about the cuts yet, or maybe you knew they were going to happen. So are there things that you would say we should be doing absolutely? If you had to make a case for which ones would you recommend, how would you do that? I guess is a question. So obviously 29, that's a lot. I don't know if you did a sort of evaluation of how much that would cost if implemented, but I'm guessing everything has a price. So would you recommend certain things over others? And I guess I have two very other questions, maybe if you have time to comment on that. You talked about the merger. I know this was not a foreign policy review, but I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about whether policy coherence was actually achieved as a result of it, given what happened in DFID. And when Canada did it, DFAT, the Australians did the same thing. So I have yet to see convincing evidence that it actually made a difference. If it did, I'd like to see the evidence for that. That's on the merger. And then the final thing, which I think is interesting, it's about mobility, which you talked about. But I've always seen rotation as also being a problem. Because you constantly, I mean, as an academic who regularly meets with Global Affairs Canada people, I can't tell you how many times I have to re-explain what this is, because you have somebody who just came into a new department on rotation, and then in a few years they disappear. So you really don't have a core group of expertise that remains in terms of institutional memory. So how do you balance those two things? On the one hand, yes, people want to be mobile and progress in their careers, but at the same time, it's a problem for the organization because you constantly have new people into roles that they've never really thought about. So they have to reappoint them or relearn something, right, from zero. So I have I've always seen rotation as being more of a problem than a.
Right.
But of course, I'm an academic, so I don't work at global affairs. But I think it's an issue. Yes.
Well, those are three very interesting points. Thank you. Let's start with the last one. This gets into the specialist versus generalist. And a few years ago, there were FS4 positions established. The officer would not necessarily aspire to management level, but instead salary band go into that category. And on hand would be there for the duration. So you can have a specialist on trade policy in a certain area. It can be posted to the WTO and do the job there. So it's can have that mobility for your specialist. But that program, and I stand to be corrected, didn't really work out as planned. So have some at that specialist level who remain and others who don't, and also because there wasn't continuous recruitment, that sort of program got stuck. But you can have someone who can develop a speciality, go abroad, Gulf assistance area, for example, come back, and if the specialty is humanitarian relief, or if it's health policy, there's going to be a lot more emphasis on that, but a lot of that is done. And health department. Then you can present people around. So the mobility aspect is important. On the first point that you made on budget, we deliberately did not have a recommendation in there. You might refer to the expression coming from the UK, more foreign, less office. That is really up to governments to decide, because you could argue that you don't necessarily need in all sectors as many diplomatic officers abroad as you might in other areas. So it's really up to the government to decide that. We did not know that there would be a budgetary cutting exercise coming, but we do know, and there are stats in the report, that there are a number of positions, significant number of positions that are unencumbered that could probably be cut. There are ways to redistribute as well. There is also an over-reporting component. This is my view. It's not that clear in the report in terms of what missions in particular have to do on the financial accounting side. I will have to make sure accountability that all of that is fine, but you're not sent abroad to spend your time filling out templates. And my farewell message when I left, I referred to death by template. I still see it that way because I saw it as a bit of a done. That said, the recommendations that we make, it is clear to me that more money will be required. And that is a challenge. I think it's a challenge for any government to convince its supporters or convince the electorate that all of that is necessary, because elections are usually not fought on foreign policy issues. There's been one that was sort of on the first match, but it's a little bit iffy. So that is why, and I keep coming back to recommendation. People have to know what the department does, and not just see it when there's a crisis and we have to get people out of a certain country. And I think the political level has to have the confidence to let diplomats speak from time to time, as was the case for the recent evacuation of Canadians from Israel. Gaza, where the assistant deputy ministers went out. I remember back in 2006, we were evacuating out of Lebanon. I chaired the task force, and the Harper government was fairly new at that point, and I was asked to give daily briefings, and that helped a lot in terms of letting people know what we were actually doing and what we can't do. So that's a whole other area, I know. But the challenge for those working on transformation, Mr. Chevalier, is how to get that right balance between redistributing what you have and saying, okay, we've done our best here, but we really need more to achieve this, and that has to be done at the cabinet table.
There's a question about the merger, but we can talk about that.
Okay, that's right. Immediately.
Hi, my name is Ola. I'm a student in the JD MA program, and I previously worked as a trade commissioner, locally engaged staff.
Where?
Tanzania, Dar es Salaam, Dar es Salaam, Quebec.
Oh.
My question though is about the use of AI. So the report briefly touches on technological challenges and opportunities. So have you been able to explore any promising uses of AI within foreign services?
I think that's worth another. No, I'm serious, and people have said you really need to get into the tech so much. And I remember through my career, there were various programs and tech programs that were introduced that were more secure, including encryption. So my first posting was in Havana. We still had a cipher clerk, communicators they were called at that time. So you'd write a report and it would be encrypted and sent, and come back and be decrypted. And then we eventually moved to everyone having a desktop, laptops, iPads, and everything else. Now, and the technology changed with that. I'm not convinced the technology is changing quickly enough in terms of keeping malign actors at bay. And I think it's with AI going off a bit of a tangent here. One of my favorite comics was George Carlin, because it was just so dark. Now you see that there's been an AI generated thing, and his family is actually suing people who did it. What's to prevent AI technology from being used in diplomacy, or in fact deep fakes? And I think that's what we're moving to as well. I think it's a great concern when in fact the basis of any diplomatic activity is to have your network to engage with others, trade commission work.
Other questions?
My name is Ambar. I'm from Kazakh Embassy. Thank you for the speech.
I'm sorry, which embassy?
Kazakhstan Embassy.
Kazakhstan. Okay, good.
Some of the points you mentioned could be applied to any diplomats in the world. So much. I have only one question. Due to my job, we travel a lot to provinces like Saskatchewan, Calgary, and meet various businesses that is in foreign countries. And they often raise the question or claims that our interest, the Canadian businesses, is not well protected abroad. Is it so?
Well presented abroad?
Not protected, not promoted well by the government. Is it so? What you can?
Well, my short answer is I don't know what it's like right now, but I do know that our Trade Commissioner Service has been around since before the Department of External Affairs was founded, so it's been around since the 1880s, and we have a very dynamic trade support component. We also have a business sector that is quite happily engaged in working within the NAFTA or CUSMA context. And we talked before about lack of risk taking in the bureaucracy. I think that applies to the business sector as well. But the business sector does have supports. There's the EDC, there's the CCC in terms of doing things to support Canadian business. Even in my current job, I occasionally get messages from business people asking for whatever could be given them. And in many cases, they didn't know that we have a trade commissioner service abroad that is integrated into the department, that is integrated into our missions. Now, those doing business with the United States know that, but with other countries, I think Kazakhstan is probably a good example. There isn't that knowledge. The mining sector is there quite global. But if you're looking at SMEs and small and medium enterprises, not necessarily. So goes back to point one, get the message out in terms of the services that are offered.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Hi, my name is Valentina. I'm a student at the Norman Patterson School. So recommendation 23 discusses the importance of recognizing the diversity of family composition and simplifying administrative positions, which is a very core Canadian value, promoting diversity, but we often work with countries whose values or realities do not align with ours. So how do you suggest that we strike a balance between promoting Canadian values versus working with countries who do not share these values? You know, for instance, a great foreign services agent who might be a really great fit for a country, but they're in a same-sex marriage, so might not be safe for them to work in this country. Same with accessibility issues. So how do you strike balance between these two?
I think it's difficult because it often depends on the receiving country. And I do think progress has been made. We have a lot of people abroad who are in same-sex couple situations, at least there were when I left the department. And I do recall, without telling too many tales out of school, I had to go to bat as I was then associate deputy minister, but in charge of deputy or a few where the countries were reluctant to grant to our head of mission because he or she was gay, and or with a same-sex partner. So I think things have moved along. Fortunately, we don't have an embassy or a high commission in Kampala now, because it would be very difficult to send someone there. So you have to kind of look at that and exercise some suasion and persuasion behind the scenes. Other countries face the same situation, and also job sharing. Have situations where you're in an employee couple, and the Germans have been quite successful on that in terms of sharing responsibilities. One person will have the job for a year or 2 years, then fill the job. Or cases where you have couples who are in different countries, that becomes problematic as well, and that gets into that territory of the Foreign Service directives. So people change, and when I joined, it was simply understood that a trailing spouse, invariably a woman at that time, would just have to make do with the situation. That's changed. Okay.
And I don't know if we have any questions online that we might consider at this point.
I don't see any.
Are there any other questions from the floor?
Maybe.
Yes.
I was trying to leave it for students. My name is Meredith Lilly. I'm a professor here at NPSIA. Thanks, Senator Bean, for coming. I guess it relates a little bit to what Val was talking about on the transparency side. As you know, I'm very big on transparency, and you've done lots in the way of transparency with respect to this report, sanctions report, other ways in which I think it's been really important, the work you've done to give life and public kind of view to what's happening in different parts of foreign affairs. I have to say that the impression that I often come away with, because I do attend a lot of events here in Canada, meet with a lot of foreign diplomats, is that foreign diplomats posted here in Canada are much more open and transparent and forward. You know, they speak very openly about their concerns and the files that they're working on. And I still come away with an impression when I speak to Canadian GAC employees here in Ottawa that they're constantly guarded about what they say in public, even if it's in a quasi-private setting. And so I just wonder what kind of advice that you could give to GAC, Foreign Service, or even with respect to reporting around transparency issues and that link to demonstrating value for money to the public.
Well, that's a really great question, Meredith. It might sound strange. I saw myself as a risk taker as a foreign service officer. So whether in Cuba or in Central America in the early days, and so I was reading with great interest the reports on the GSRP program. Is this really quasi-intelligence? That's what I was doing down there. I was meeting with dissidents, with human rights activists, that kind of stuff. It was a lot of fun, and you get out there and you talk to people about it, and you talk to your colleagues, certainly from the friendly countries, and from the unfriendly countries. Yeah, you can have some discussions as well. I'm going to the Cuban National Day tonight. I've been asked to make some comments. You know, I will make some comments. They won't all be pleasant, but you know. I think people need to do that within, and I don't know. Traditionally, diplomats are just. I would agree with that. Foreign representatives here. I think we're talking to the same ones. They're quite open in what they think, and our people generally tend to be guarded. And I don't know whether it's because people think, oh, well, that's going to harm my career and what would others say. But I think intrinsically, if you've been hired into the Foreign Service, you have to have some judgment. I mentioned that before, and you got to know when to stop and what you can say, because you don't want to embarrass the government. So on the other hand, you can be more forthcoming on certain issues because people actually want to hear our perspective. And those who are posted here from other countries, that's what they want. They want to hear, well, what is it you think? And you can't say, oh, well, Mr. hasn't signed off on that, or we believe in projecting Canadian values. Well, that's not going to get you very far. So I don't know if there's an easy answer to that. We try to address that a little bit. And it does make me think too that on policy issues, I think in practice, de facto, Global Affairs Canada is a central agency, but it doesn't necessarily work that way. And that is one of the big challenges.
I have a two-fingered follow-up to that, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I think one of the things that I've noticed, I've had various interactions and touch points with global affairs and foreign affairs over the years. One of the things that I noticed over time is the decline in reporting from the field, right? So a lot of what I saw when I was in Mozambique most recently was people would send news articles instead of providing that perspective. And a traditional foreign service officer is trained to interpret events in a country through the lens of Canadian interests and report that back.
Yep.
Do you think one of the reasons why the culture of transparency and this risk aversity prevails is linked to the lack of that kind of intellectual exercise of sharing perspectives, getting feedback from headquarters on those perspectives, that kind of culture of intellectual debate that used to occur? I'm not sure the extent to which it still does.
I think that's a very interesting point. It gets down to the craft and the vocation part of our work. Some of the advice that I would give people going out, especially heads of mission, if you're going to a small mission, if you're going to report, we don't need to hear something every week about what's happening. But if you are judicious and send an analytical report every so often, recognizing that maybe some countries, some relationships are more important, people are going to read. And the other element that I think has changed things. So when I was active, you would write a report. It could be sent as a dispatch or whatever, and the list of addressees was relatively limited, and they could circulate further if they wanted to. With greater technology, we started getting into these huge distribution lists, and there was a message from our consulate general in Chicago several years ago addressed to me that got leaked, and this was on Obama's sites. People are afraid of them. They're afraid of leakage. And then you add to that, we didn't always have a 24/7 news cycle, but 24/7 news cycle was for what, 30 years or something like that. And of course, social media. So people are very wary that things are going to just pop off somewhere and all the focus will be on them. So that contributes to the bureaucratic reticence that you suggested. So, I would agree. I mean, I used to like nothing more than reading a long dispatch, a long message that was carefully crafted by either the head of mission or political counselor, or even the more junior officers. And that was a good thing. Then you talk about it afterwards. And in some cases, also it was shared with our allies. So I'm not sure. I'm 5 years out of it, or actually 6 years. I was offline. I don't know how much of that occurs.
My name is Sonia Jaworski. I'm a student here at NPSIA. You'd mentioned, touched on social media a little bit earlier, and the threats that it potentially poses in terms of disinformation. I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit and comment also on whether you see any benefits of social media for the Foreign Service.
I think there are benefits. I think social media is a very useful tool in terms of getting messages out. I'm not sure the Twitter, now X platform is really great. There's a lot of interest in this early on. But you can also undertake policy to some degree by social media. Two examples. The tweet that went out about incarcerating Saudi Arabia led to a big problem bilaterally between Saudi Arabia and Canada. And then my own experience in Charlotte, a rather irritated Donald Trump decided to send a tweet out from the aircraft, having left the summit early, being more concentrated on this meeting with Chairman Kim, and totally unprepared for the G7 discussion for 2 days. That's another example how that can impact policy and indeed perceptions. So it's a tool that you have to be careful with. It's not clear who runs platforms, and my daughter is in the second year studies LGBT, and she gets a lot of her stuff from TikTok. I'm not sure that's the best platform either, and traditional media sources are viewed with suspicion. So I don't know. I think it's a tool and a means of communication that is evolving, as certainly the internet was at the beginning when Al Gore invented it. Sorry. The internet was seen as a way of bringing the world together and facilitating communication. In some ways, it's really taken by actors.
I guess to just expand on that a little bit, do you see, I suppose, do you see a way of overcoming those threats, or I guess what are the main threats that you see? it posing to Canada's foreign interests?
Well, I think an inquiry has just started for interference, and I'm hoping that some of that will come out. When I say there are malign actors, it's not necessarily that they want to attack Canada physically, but they would like to be disruptive in our politics and in our way of life. And we're not a target country, although I sometimes think we're an easier target, serve as a proxy target for southern neighbor. But that is a big challenge, and hopefully we can learn some lessons from that.
Very much, Senator Beam, for a really interesting presentation, a really important report. I think that that's going to push us to think through our foreign service, ensuring that it's fit for purpose. Really a delight to have you here at the school. We have just a little bag as a thank you from the school. Thanks very much.